The blizzard had been raging for 2 days when Jake Morrison spotted the metallic glint through his research station's frost-covered window. The wind was screaming outside like a living thing, rattling the walls of his small outpost in the middle of nowhere Iceland. Jake had been stuck inside, running the same tests on ice samples he'd been running for months. Boring work, but someone had to do it. At first he thought it was just ice playing tricks on his eyes. The way the snow swirled in the wind could make you see all kinds of things that weren't really there. He'd been alone for 3 weeks now, and sometimes the isolation got to you. Made you imagine stuff. But this metallic glint didn't go away. It stayed there, consistent, catching what little light filtered through the storm clouds. Something told him to check it out. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was just the desperate need to do something different after being cooped up for so long. Whatever it was, Jake couldn't ignore it. He bundled up in his thermal gear, the thick kind that made you look like a walking marshmallow. 3 layers of everything. Goggles. Gloves so thick he could barely move his fingers. The kind of outfit that said you weren't messing around with the cold. Because out here, the cold could kill you in minutes if you weren't careful. The moment he stepped outside, the wind tried to knock him over. It was brutal out there, worse than he'd thought. The snow hit his face like tiny needles, even through the protective gear. He could barely see 3 feet in front of him. But Jake pushed forward, 1 step at a time, following that metallic glint. It took him almost 20 minutes to reach it, even though it was only about 100 yards from his station. That's how bad the storm was. When he finally got close enough to see it properly, Jake stopped dead in his tracks. It was a ship. Had to be. But not like any ship he'd ever seen. The thing was huge, maybe 30 feet long, half buried in the snow and ice. The metal was dark, almost black, with a texture that seemed to shift when he looked at it. Smooth but not quite. Like it was made of something that didn't follow normal rules. The weirdest part? It was warm. Not hot, but warm enough that the snow near it was melting, even in this freezing storm. Jake pulled off his glove for just a second to touch it, and yeah, definitely warm. That didn't make any sense. He found an opening, a crack in the hull that was big enough to squeeze through. Jake knew he probably shouldn't go in. This could be dangerous. Could be leaking radiation or chemicals or who knew what. But curiosity won out over common sense. It usually did with him. Inside, the air was warmer but stale. Emergency lights flickered weakly, casting strange shadows everywhere. The interior was like nothing Jake had ever seen. Curved walls, symbols he didn't recognize, technology that looked both ancient and impossibly advanced at the same time. Then he saw them. 3 massive creatures lay on the floor, completely still. Jake's heart nearly stopped. They were enormous, each one easily the size of a small car. They looked like something out of a fantasy movie. Dragons, his brain supplied, even though he knew that was impossible. They had scaled bodies that seemed to be covered in plates of armor like skin. Powerful limbs with claws that could probably tear through steel. Wings folded tight against their sides, the membrane between the bones thin and translucent. But what really caught Jake's attention were the colors. Their scales weren't just one color. They shimmered and shifted, showing blues and purples and greens he'd never seen before. And beneath their skin he could see faint lights pulsing. Like they had tiny stars inside them. But the lights were getting dimmer, slower, like a heartbeat fading away. They were dying. Jake didn't need to be a doctor to see that. Their breathing was wrong, too slow and shallow. Frost was forming on their scales, which seemed really wrong given how warm the ship was. These creatures clearly weren't built for cold like this. One of them must have sensed him standing there. Its eye opened slowly, just a crack. The eye was brilliant amber, almost golden, with a pupil that was more like a cat's than anything human. It looked right at Jake, and for a moment they just stared at each other. Jake expected to see fear or maybe anger or aggression. But there was nothing like that in that gaze. Just acceptance. Calm, peaceful acceptance. This creature knew it was dying, and it had made peace with it. All 3 of them had. They'd been here for a while, Jake realized. Days, maybe weeks. Slowly freezing to death in this crashed ship, unable to call for help, unable to escape. They'd given up. Jake Morrison hadn't come to Iceland to be a hero. He'd come here to study climate patterns and ice cores and all that boring but important science stuff. He was just a regular guy doing a job. But as he stood there in that alien ship, watching these magnificent creatures slowly fade away, something inside him just refused to accept it. These beings had traveled across space somehow, had come from somewhere beyond Earth, and they were going to die here in the ice because nobody knew they existed? That didn't sit right with Jake. It didn't sit right at all. Not on my watch, he muttered under his breath, his mind already racing through possibilities. He had no idea how he was going to move them. No idea if he could even help them. But he was damn sure going to try. Jake spent the next 6 hours doing the impossible. And let me tell you, those were the hardest 6 hours of his entire life. The station's utility sled wasn't designed for this. It was meant for moving equipment boxes and supply crates, not alien creatures the size of compact cars. But it was all Jake had, so it would have to work. He gathered every bit of rope he could find in the storage closet. Climbing rope, bungee cords, even some old extension cords. Anything that could pull weight. Getting the first creature onto the sled was a nightmare. Jake had to use a makeshift ramp made from metal sheets, and even then, it took him almost an hour of pushing, pulling, and a lot of creative problem solving. The creature was completely unconscious, which made it dead weight. Jake wedged himself behind it and pushed with everything he had, his boots slipping on the icy floor of the ship. His back screamed in protest. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold. When he finally got it secured on the sled, Jake had to drag the whole thing across the ice back to his station. The sled kept getting stuck in snowdrifts. The wind fought him every step of the way. His legs burned like fire. But slowly, painfully, he made progress. Step by step, he hauled that creature across the frozen wasteland. Getting it into the hangar was another battle entirely. The doorway was barely wide enough. Jake had to angle the sled just right, then pull with every ounce of strength he had left. When the creature finally slid inside, Jake collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. His whole body shook from exhaustion. But he couldn't rest. There were 2 more to go. The second one was even harder because Jake was already exhausted. His muscles felt like jelly. Every movement hurt. His hands were so cold inside his gloves that he could barely feel his fingers anymore. Twice he had to stop and warm them up, knowing that frostbite was a real danger. But he kept going back out into that storm, kept making that brutal trip between the crashed ship and his station. By the time he started on the third creature, Jake was running on pure stubbornness. His body wanted to quit. His brain was screaming at him to just stop, rest, deal with it later. But Jake knew there wasn't a later. These beings were dying right now. If he didn't get them to warmth soon, it would be too late. The third creature was the smallest of the 3, but it might as well have weighed a ton. Jake's arms felt like rubber. He kept dropping the rope. His vision blurred from exhaustion. At one point he actually fell face-first into the snow and just lay there for a minute, wondering if he could actually do this. Then he thought about those amber eyes looking at him with such peaceful acceptance of death, and he forced himself back up. One more. Just one more. When he finally got all 3 creatures into the hangar, Jake wanted nothing more than to collapse and sleep for a week. But the work wasn't done yet. Not even close. The hangar was just a big storage space, meant for keeping equipment and supplies. It definitely wasn't designed to be a medical facility for alien life forms. But Jake was going to make it work somehow. He cranked every portable heater he owned to maximum power. 5 heaters total, all pointing at the creatures. He sealed every gap in the doors with duct tape and plastic sheeting to keep the cold air out. Then he watched the temperature gauge on the wall slowly, agonizingly slowly, start to climb. 10 degrees Celsius. 15. 20. The creatures needed warmth. Jake could literally feel the cold radiating off their bodies, like they were made of ice themselves. Their scales were covered in frost that needed to melt. Jake pulled off his soaking wet gear and grabbed some towels, gently trying to wipe the ice off their scales. He had no idea if he was helping or making things worse, but he had to do something. He checked their breathing, counted their heartbeats by pressing his hand against their chests. Too slow. Everything was too slow. Then, after what felt like forever, the eldest one stirred. Its eyes opened slowly, blinking against the harsh lights of the hangar. Those amber eyes focused on Jake immediately, sharp and aware. The creature made a low rumbling sound deep in its chest, like distant thunder. Then it did something Jake didn't expect at all. It tried to push itself up, its powerful legs shaking with effort. And it started moving toward the door. At first, Jake didn't understand. Was it trying to escape? Was it scared of him? Then it hit him like a punch to the gut. The creature was trying to leave. It was trying to go back outside into the freezing cold. It was trying to die out there so it wouldn't waste Jake's resources. The realization made Jake's chest tighten. This magnificent being, this intelligent creature from another world, had already decided it wasn't worth saving. It would rather die in the cold than be a burden to the strange alien who'd found it. "Hey, no," Jake said firmly, stepping directly in front of the creature and blocking its path to the door. His voice came out stronger than he felt. "You're staying right here. I didn't haul your heavy butt across the ice just so you could go freeze to death outside." The creature stopped, tilting its massive head to one side. Even through the obvious differences in their species, Jake could see confusion written all over its face. Those intelligent eyes studied him like it was trying to figure out what kind of crazy creature would do what Jake had just done. In its world, Jake realized this didn't make sense. Nobody saved strangers. Nobody risked their own survival for beings they didn't know. Survival meant looking out for your own kind, your own family, your own species. That's how nature worked everywhere apparently. But not here. Not with humans. Jake pulled out his emergency rations from the storage locker. Freeze-dried meals, protein bars, canned goods. He had enough food to last himself maybe 3 more months alone. Now he had 3 extra mouths to feed and he had no idea what these creatures even ate. He'd have to figure it out as he went. He'd have to make everything stretch somehow. "Welcome to Earth," Jake said quietly, meeting those confused amber eyes. He managed a tired smile. "We do things differently here. You're not dying on my watch, understand? None of you are." The creature just stared at him for a long moment, then slowly, carefully, lowered itself back down to the warm floor. It kept its eyes on Jake the whole time, like it still couldn't quite believe what was happening. Jake grabbed a blanket and sat down against the wall, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. But even as his eyes started to close, he felt a small spark of hope. They were alive. All 3 of them were still alive. And Jake was going to keep them that way no matter what it took. By day 4, Jake had learned their names. Well, sort of. The sounds they made were nothing like human words. Deep rumbles that came from somewhere in their chests, with clicks and growls mixed in. Jake's throat definitely wasn't built to make those kinds of noises. But he tried his best and eventually they seemed to accept his clumsy attempts. The eldest one was Vrock. At least that's what it sounded like when Jake tried to copy the rumbling sound. Vrock was clearly the leader, the one who made decisions. His scales were darker, almost black with streaks of deep purple. He had scars too, old ones that told stories of a long life filled with battles and survival. The middle one was Thyra. She was slightly smaller than Vrock but still massive by human standards. Her coloring was different, deeper blue tones that seemed to shift in the light. There was something careful about the way she moved, like she was always thinking 3 steps ahead. Jake got the sense she was the smart one, the planner of the group. The youngest was Kess. She was barely more than a teenager by their standards, Jake figured. Her scales had bright green markings that reminded him of neon lights. She was curious about everything, always watching Jake with those big eyes, tilting her head when he did something interesting. Despite everything they'd been through, she still had that spark of youth in her. Communication was rough at first. Really rough. Jake tried English, obviously, but they just stared at him like he was making random noise. Which, to be fair, he probably was to them. So they had to get creative. They used deep rumbles for yes and no. Different tones meant different things. Body language helped a lot. A raised claw meant stop. A lowered head meant agreement. Vrock would spread his wings slightly when he was trying to explain something important. But the real breakthrough came when Jake started drawing in the frost on the hangar floor. The cold metal floor collected condensation, and Jake realized he could use it like a whiteboard. He drew a stick figure of himself, then pointed at his chest. Then he drew 3 big creatures and pointed at them. Kess got it first. Her eyes lit up, and she reached out with one careful claw to draw in the frost too. She was better at it than Jake, her drawings more detailed. Over the next few days they built a whole vocabulary of pictures and symbols. That's how Jake learned their story. Vrock drew their world, a place called Draven. It looked harsh, with sharp mountains and deep valleys. No oceans like Earth. Thyra drew their ship traveling through space, then showed it getting caught in something that looked like a whirlpool. A space anomaly of some kind. Kess drew the crash, the impact, the cold closing in. Their ship was dead. No power. No way to send a message home. No rescue was coming. They'd known that from the beginning. The hardest part was understanding their culture. Vrock spent a long time trying to explain it through gestures and drawings. In their world, survival was everything. Resources were limited. The strong survived, the weak didn't. That wasn't cruel, it was just how things were. It had to be that way or everyone died. When someone was hurt or sick beyond helping, they went away to die. They didn't burden the group. They didn't use up resources that could save someone stronger. Vrock drew pictures of creatures walking away from their groups, choosing death so others could live. "That's why you tried to leave," Jake said, even though he knew Vrock couldn't understand his words. "You thought you were doing the right thing." Jake shook his head firmly. He drew a different picture. Humans helping each other. People carrying the wounded. Groups staying together. "Not here," he said. "Here we take care of each other. That's what makes us strong." The concept seemed to completely baffle them. Thyra kept tilting her head, like she was trying to make sense of something that broke all her understanding of how the universe worked. These were apex predators from a harsh world. Beings who'd probably never been helpless in their entire lives. They'd never needed help before, never asked for it, never expected it. Yet here was this tiny, fragile human working himself to exhaustion for them. Jake barely reached Kessa's shoulder. He had no claws, no armor, no wings. He was soft and weak by their standards. One swipe from Vrock could probably kill him without even trying. But Jake kept going. He shared his food with them even though his own stomach growled with hunger. He figured out they could eat some of his protein bars though they made faces like it tasted terrible. Jake couldn't help but laugh at that. "Yeah, I know," he said. "They're not great. But they'll keep you alive." He stayed up through the nights monitoring their temperatures with a simple thermometer. He learned that Vrock needed it warmer than the others. Thyra seemed to handle cold better but needed more food. Kess was somewhere in between but got restless if she couldn't move around. When the power fluctuated on day 6, threatening to shut down the heaters, Jake made a choice that would have seemed crazy to anyone watching. He took his research notes, months of work, data he'd traveled to Iceland to collect, and he burned them in a metal barrel to create heat. Pages and pages of scientific observations went up in flames. Thyra watched him do it and Jake swore he saw something like shock in her eyes. She understood what he was destroying. Knowledge. Or important things. And he was burning it all to keep them warm. One night, around day 7, Jake finally crashed. He'd been running on maybe 2 hours of sleep a day and his body just gave out. He slumped against the wall, intending to rest for just a minute, and he was out like a light. When he woke up hours later, something felt different. Warmer. He opened his eyes and realized Kess had moved during the night. She was lying beside him now, her large body curled around him protectively. Her scales were warm, radiating heat that had kept him from freezing. Thyra had positioned herself near the door, blocking the cold drafts that kept sneaking in through the gaps. Vrock was awake, watching the entrance like a guard. They were protecting him now too. Jake felt something tighten in his chest. These alien beings, who'd been taught their whole lives that survival meant looking out for yourself, were now looking out for him. They'd learned something new here on Earth. They'd learned what it meant to be part of a team, to care about someone who wasn't your own species. "We're going to make it," Jake whispered to them. "All of us. Together." The storm hit on day 12 with a fury that made the previous blizzard look like a light snow shower. Jake had been checking the weather reports all morning, watching the warnings get more and more serious. Extreme conditions expected. Winds over 100 miles per hour. Temperature drops that could kill an exposed human in under 5 minutes. The meteorologists were calling it a once-in-a-century storm. He watched through the window as the sky turned an ugly gray-black color. The wind started howling like some kind of angry beast. Then the real violence began. Snow didn't just fall, it attacked horizontally, hitting the station walls so hard it sounded like gunfire. Jake kept his eyes glued to the wind speed monitor. 50 miles per hour. 70. 90. The numbers kept climbing past what anyone could survive outside. The whole building shook with each gust. Then the main generator sputtered. Jake's heart dropped into his stomach. No, no, no. Not now. He ran to the equipment room, but he already knew what he'd find. The generator was ancient, probably should have been replaced years ago. And now, in the middle of the worst storm in decades, it had finally given up. The lights flickered. The heaters went silent. Then the emergency power kicked in with a dull hum. But Jake knew immediately it wasn't enough. The emergency system was designed to keep one person alive in the main quarters until rescue came. It wasn't designed to heat a massive hangar full of alien life forms who needed tropical temperatures to survive. He stood in front of the control panel, staring at the power distribution screen. The math was brutal and simple. He had enough emergency power for one thing. Either his quarters or the hangar. Not both. If he routed power to his quarters, he'd be safe. Warm. He could wait out the storm in comfort. The creatures would freeze slowly over the next few days. They'd probably just go to sleep and never wake up. Peaceful even. If he routed power to the hangar, he'd be in serious danger. The control room where he'd have to work would drop to deadly temperatures. He might not survive. Jake's finger moved to the hangar circuit before he'd even finished thinking it through. He pressed the button. The decision was made. The temperature in his control room started dropping immediately. Jake could see his breath within minutes. He pulled on every layer he owned. Thermal underwear, 2 sweaters, his heavy winter coat, his survival suit over all of it. Gloves so thick he could barely use his fingers. He looked ridiculous, but he didn't care. The generator needed a bypass. Some way to squeeze more power out of the dying system. Jake grabbed his tools and got to work, his thick gloves making everything 10 times harder. The metal of the tools was so cold it burned his hands even through the gloves. The heaters in the hangar needed more fuel. Jake started dragging anything that could burn into the hangar. Wooden crates, old furniture, his desk, his chair. He piled it all up and got fires going in metal barrels, placing them strategically around the creatures. The monitoring systems needed constant attention. The creatures' temperatures kept dropping despite everything. Jake had to keep adjusting, moving heaters, adding more fuel, checking vital signs. For 3 days, Jake lived in a nightmare. He hand-cranked the backup generator when the emergency power dipped too low. The crank was stiff and cold, and it took all his strength to turn it. 15 minutes of cranking just to get another hour of power. His arms screamed. His back felt like it was breaking. But he kept cranking. He burned everything he could find. His books. His spare clothes. Equipment that cost thousands of dollars. Scientific instruments. All of it went into the fires. The smell of burning plastic and wood filled the station. When he ran out of things to burn, Jake got creative. He mixed chemicals from the research lab to create exothermic reactions. Reactions that produced heat. It was dangerous work, especially with his foggy brain and numb fingers. One wrong mixture could cause an explosion. But he didn't have a choice. His fingers went numb over and over. Jake had to keep stopping to warm them up, terrified of frostbite. He'd stick them under his armpits or hold them over the fires, waiting for the painful tingling that meant blood was flowing again. His thoughts grew foggy from exhaustion and cold. Jake started making mistakes, dropping tools, forgetting what he was doing mid-task. He'd find himself standing in the middle of the room, not remembering how he got there. But every time he was about to give up, he'd check the hangar monitors. 3 life signs on the screen. 3 heartbeats still going. Still alive because of him. And that was enough to keep him moving. The creatures could see him through the hangar's security camera. They watched this crazy human fighting a battle he couldn't win. Working himself to death in temperatures that should have killed him already. Vrock tried to roar at him through the door. Deep, commanding sounds that clearly meant, stop. Save yourself. Jake could see him on the monitor, trying to stand, trying to make Jake understand. Thyra beat her wings against the doors, trying to break through the reinforced metal. She wanted to get out, to leave, to end this so Jake would stop wasting his energy on them. The doors shook but held. Jake just kept working. He taped a picture of the 3 of them to the control panel. Every time he felt himself giving up, he'd look at that picture and find the strength to keep going. On the 3rd night, Jake was stumbling through another generator repair. His whole body shook from cold and exhaustion. His hands weren't working right anymore. He dropped a wrench and just stared at it on the floor, too tired to pick it up. That's when he saw something slide through the mail slot between the control room and the hangar. A piece of membrane, thin and flexible, glowing faintly with internal heat. Jake picked it up with shaking hands. It was warm. Really warm. He realized what it was immediately. Wing membrane. From Kess. She'd torn a piece of her own wing to give to him. He looked at the camera and saw her there, favoring one wing, a small tear visible in the membrane. It would heal, probably. But it had to hurt. And she'd done it anyway. Jake felt tears freeze on his cheeks. They were trying to save him the only way they could. These beings who'd been taught that survival meant looking out for yourself. They were sacrificing their own comfort, their own body, to help him. He wrapped the warm membrane around his chest, under his coat. The heat spread through his body, giving him just enough strength to keep going. "I'm not stopping," Jake whispered to the camera. "Not until we all make it through this." And he got back to work. Dawn on day 15 brought something Jake hadn't heard in what felt like forever. Silence. The wind had stopped howling. The walls weren't shaking anymore. Jake lifted his head from where he'd been slumped over the control panel and just listened to the quiet. It was almost eerie after 3 days of constant noise and violence. The storm had passed. Somehow, impossibly, they'd all made it through. Jake tried to stand up and his legs nearly gave out. Everything hurt. His whole body felt like one giant bruise. His fingers were swollen and red from the cold. His lips were cracked and bleeding. He was pretty sure he'd lost at least 15 pounds. But he was alive. More importantly, he checked the monitors. 3 life signs in the hangar, all stable. The creatures had survived too. Jake stumbled into the hangar, moving like an old man. The creatures looked rough. Their scales were dull and they moved slowly. But they were breathing. They were okay. "We made it," Jake croaked, his voice barely working. "We actually made it." Vrock lifted his head and made a soft rumbling sound. It almost sounded like relief. But Jake knew they weren't out of danger yet. His supplies were almost gone. The station was barely functional. And nobody knew they were here. The regular supply ship wasn't due for another month. They'd never last that long. He needed to send a signal. Get help. But how? Then Jake remembered the crashed ship. He dragged himself back outside into the bright sunlight, squinting against the glare of sun on fresh snow. The ship was still there, half buried but accessible. Jake spent the next few hours pulling apart the alien technology, trying to understand how it worked. He didn't understand most of it, but he knew enough about electronics to recognize power sources and transmission equipment. Using parts from the ship and parts from his own damaged radio equipment, Jake started building something. A beacon. A distress signal that hopefully someone would pick up. His hands shook as he worked. This was his last chance. If this didn't work, they were all done. It took him 3 hours to wire everything together. The beacon looked like a mess of alien tech and Earth equipment held together with duct tape and hope. But when Jake hit the power button, lights flickered on. Something was transmitting. He had no idea if anyone would receive it. No idea if it was even sending the right kind of signal. But it was all he had left. Jake activated the beacon and then just collapsed right there in the snow. His body had nothing left to give. He'd pushed too far, survived too much. Darkness pulled him under. When consciousness came back, Jake heard voices. Human voices. People were shouting things he couldn't quite understand. Someone was wrapping him in thermal blankets. Warm hands were checking his pulse. He's alive. Get the medic over here. Jake opened his eyes to see a woman in a rescue team uniform leaning over him. She looked shocked to see him conscious. The hangar, Jake managed to whisper. 3, in the hangar. We know, she said gently. We found them. Just rest now. Jake could hear more voices in the distance. Someone was talking into a radio, their voice full of disbelief. Command, you're not going to believe this. 3 aliens in the hangar. Confirmed, 3 living alien beings. And this crazy scientist somehow kept them alive through the worst storm we've seen in 50 years. He should be dead. They should all be dead. I don't know how any of them made it. Jake smiled weakly. Yeah, he didn't really know how they'd made it either. But they had. Then the darkness pulled him back under, and this time it was peaceful. The next few weeks were a blur. Jake woke up in a hospital in Reykjavik. Doctors told him he'd been unconscious for 2 days. He had severe exhaustion, malnutrition, and mild frostbite, but he'd recover fully. They called him lucky. Jake called himself stubborn. The creatures, everyone was calling them the Dravek now, had been moved to a secure facility where scientists were learning how to properly care for them. They were recovering well. Jake asked to see them, but there was red tape. Security concerns. Protocols. All that government stuff. 6 months passed. Jake went back to his normal life, or tried to. But normal didn't really fit anymore. How do you go back to studying ice cores after you've saved alien lives and survived the impossible? Then one evening, sitting in his small apartment in Reykjavik, Jake got an email. The subject line just said, Priority Message, Government Security Level. His hands shook as he opened it. The message had been routed through NASA, the State Department, the United Nations, and probably a dozen other agencies Jake didn't even know existed. But it was addressed to him. To Jake Morrison. The video file loaded, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. Vrock's face filled the screen. He looked incredible. Healthy. Strong. His scales were shining with those deep purple colors Jake remembered. Behind him stood Thyra and Kess, both looking better than Jake had ever seen them. Jake Morrison. Vrock's voice came through, translated by some kind of technology into English. But Jake could still hear the deep rumble underneath. Your species is unlike any we have encountered in our travels across the stars. Jake leaned closer to the screen, his eyes burning. You possessed no logical reason to save us, Vrock continued. We were strangers. Unknown. We cost you resources, safety, and nearly your life. By every rule of survival we know, you should have left us to die. Yet you refused. Thyra moved forward. In our world, strength is measured by survival. By conquest. By dominance. You have taught us that true strength is something different. True strength is refusing to let others fall, even when it costs you everything. Kess stepped up, and Jake could see she'd grown. She looked more mature now, more confident. When she moved, he could see the small scar on her wing where she'd torn the membrane to save him. She clicked her jaw in that way Jake had learned was their version of a smile. The Dravek do not forget debts, Jake Morrison. Your world will never stand alone in this universe. We make this promise to you and all humanity. The message continued with formal stuff. Declarations of alliance between Earth and Draven. Trade agreements. Cultural exchange programs. Plans for diplomatic relations and shared technology. But Jake barely heard any of it. He was too busy wiping tears from his face. Earth had just gained its first true friends among the stars. Humanity had made first contact, and it had happened because one regular guy decided that alien lives mattered just as much as his own. Jake sat back in his chair and laughed. Then he cried. Then he laughed again. They'd made it. All of them. And the universe would never be the same.